We were in the middle of planning a 5-week road trip through America, starting and finishing in Houston, when we heard that the USS Texas, the world's only remaining Dreadnought Battleship, was moored in that city as a floating museum. We had to go and have a look, partly for historical reasons, and partly so that we could say we've stood on a Dreadnought Battleship to our friends. Walking along the slipway where the ship was moored, we could hear the engines and we could see water being pumped over the side. Clearly, as we knew, the battleship was in need of some further repair. Stepping onto the main deck, my attention at least was drawn to the left, to those big, massive 14-inch rifle guns from the aft turret. The next thing I noticed, we were walking on a wooden deck, not a steel one, and some of it was in better repair than the rest of it. Clearly, this is still a project in progress. We walked past those 40mm Boppers anti-aircraft guns into the covered area of the secondary gun deck. This is under the main bridge, and that was where a revelation occurred to me. In early 1940, as a 15-year-old, my father had enlisted as a bands boy in the Royal Marines, where he served until the mid-1950s, after the Queen's coronation. Although he served in the British Navy, not the American, and aboard cruisers, not battleships, what we were seeing would have been familiar to him and his comrades. For the remainder of our time on board the Texas, I saw things through his eyes more than my own. Climbing up into the number 1 turret, I saw, for the gun on the left, that massive shell, and in the gun on the right, those packages of cordite powder that propelled those projectiles onto the beaches of Egypt, into the cities of Italy and Normandy. I could just imagine being in this small confined space while those guns were being fired. The noise, the heat, the total lack of knowing what was happening outside that steel cage. Other people were waiting to climb into the turret, so I stepped down and back onto the main deck. Negotiating that ladder? Well, it's not something I'd like to do in a hurry, I can tell you that. You have to remember, the Texas saw battles in both World War I and World War II, and during that latter war, it saw service at every major invasion point: Africa, Italy, Normandy. The Texas and the other ships of her kind would have been familiar sights, not just to sailors, but also to soldiers and Marines, because these ships served not just as floating artillery platforms, but also as troop transports and hospital ships. While the draw card for me, and I suppose many, were those massive 14-inch rifle cannon, the Texas sported many other guns. There were the 5.5-inch secondary guns, which often fired in support of soldiers and Marines going ashore on some of those beaches. And then there were the anti-aircraft guns. Both sides of the deck were lined with these massive monuments to a war long past. But a battleship is more than just a floating platform for guns. It was time to go below decks to the living quarters. With displays hidden behind grills and lots of closed doors, there was much hidden to us. I mean, I didn't find out what actually needed decontamination on board a battleship of World War II era. The decks, though, were a surprise to me. Probably bigger than those that my father had experienced during his service. They appeared to be concrete poured over steel. They were wide and lined with lockers, which I can only imagine were used by the sailors to store their personal belongings. There were several kitchen areas used to prepare meals to feed up to 5,000 men a day. And remember, these battleships were working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Passing through the hatch, we entered an area that I'm sure my father would have found familiar. A Marine squad barracks area, with their arms stored on one side, eating utensils and bunks for up to 48 soldiers, all in an area not much bigger than the living room of an average house. And let's remember that unlike the ordinary sailors who often had to hot bunk their beds, Marines had it fairly easy with lots of space. Next up was the movie locker. This is where the movies were stored along with projectors that went into the wardrooms. Nearby was the office where company clerks and commanders carried out their administrative duties. And opposite that was a pharmacy, where pharmacists mixed up their own medicines on the go. Originally I thought this was a dental office, but no, it's a good old barber shop. The Texas rated a qualified doctor, not just a hospital corpsman. And remember when the Texas operated as a land-based artillery platform for onshore engagements. This operating room was where wounded sailors and soldiers operated on by the ship's doctor and medical corpsman. Bit primitive, but it did the job. The sick bay nearby was much more luxurious than the Marine barracks we'd seen earlier, and compared to the seamen's quarters below, it was the height of luxury. Of course, sailors being sailors, when they go ashore, they like to party. So beforehand, they were loaded up with all the necessary protections. This isolation ward wasn't for exotic diseases such as cholera or typhoid. It was for dysentery. Can you imagine, in a ship of several thousand men, dysentery running riot? Those suffering from the disease were placed in here until they'd recovered, which could take several days. Next up, we came across another barracks room where 48 Marines lived, slept, ate, and simply wasted time between the battles, which often were considerably far apart. Once again, to my father, this would probably have been luxury. Next up were the bathrooms. These are actually the washrooms where sailors, Marines, had to wash in cold seawater. The boilers on the Texas were for keeping the ship moving, not for heating water. Next to the bathrooms was the crew head. This was a busy place, and again, there was a large sluice upon which the sailors and Marines sat to do their business. There were some red seats in the toilet heads. Those were reserved for sailors and Marines who had picked up venereal disease. Life aboard ship includes clean clothing. So there was the laundry, where not only uniforms, but sheets and towels were laundered daily. There was an ironing area, probably for the officers, got to keep those number ones looking good, and a tailor shop. Down the corridor, home sweet home, the corner soda fountain. I can only imagine how popular this and the nearby canteen would have been to those sailors and Marines who had been on board for months at a time. Still stocked with the goodies of the 1940s, pipes, but that chewing gum, I don't know, could have been a bit stale for me. And some of the reading material, well, I'm sure it was very titillating for the day, but compared to modern day magazines, nah, I think I'll pass, thanks. We finally found the dental office, and actually, to be honest, I probably have preferred to have my teeth worked on in the barber shop, the age of those dental drills and the other items that were on display. Access to the lower decks was cut off that day, so we couldn't get down to the engine room. And so our time on the Texas was coming to an end. What had started out as something of a bit of a laugh, to be able to joke about having stood on the decks of a Dreadnought Battleship had turned into something much more. Our time aboard the Texas had become something personal to me, a reflection of my family history, which is why all of our Kiwi Travellers tours that go through Houston include a visit to the historic battleship. Visit our website, kiwiamtravellers.co, or find us on Facebook and check out when you too can join us on a tour of the USS Texas, the world's last remaining dreadnought battleship. I think you'll be glad you did.